Somewhere in the archaeological record, buried beneath thousands of years of silence, there is evidence that a young man in ancient Mesopotamia composed a love poem for a woman he could not stop thinking about. The poem has survived. It is roughly 4,000 years old. And when you read it, the first thing you feel is not distance. You feel recognition. Because he is nervous and hopeful and completely undone by her, and the words he chose to describe that feeling are not so different from the ones you might reach for today. That is the first thing you need to understand about ancient love. It was not a primitive version of what we feel now. It was the same thing, wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, operating inside different rules. But underneath all of that, it was the same restless, consuming, terrifying force that has been driving human behavior since before we had words to name it. The story of how ancient humans fell in love is not really about the past. It is about a feeling so fundamental to being human that no civilization, no matter how different from our own, has ever managed to live without it. And the deeper you look into the evidence, the more surprising the picture becomes, because what emerges is not a world where love was arranged away or suppressed into irrelevance. What emerges is a world absolutely saturated with longing, with jealousy, with the particular madness of wanting one specific person and no other. In ancient Egypt, love poetry was a recognized literary genre. Papyri dating back more than 3,000 years contain verses written from the perspective of young men and women describing the physical symptoms of being near someone they desired. The heart races. The hands become useless. The voice refuses to work correctly. The stomach turns. One text describes a young woman who cannot eat because the boy she loves has walked past her house, and the language she uses is so immediate, so embarrassingly specific, that you almost feel you should look away. These were not formal compositions written by priests for ritual purposes. They were personal. They were the equivalent of what someone today might type into a phone at 2 in the morning and then delete before sending. Except these were preserved, because they were written on material that survived millennia, and because the Egyptians understood that this particular category of human experience was worth keeping. Egyptian society had arranged marriages, social hierarchies, economic considerations that shaped who ended up with whom. None of that is in dispute. But the love poetry makes clear that within those structures, and sometimes in complete defiance of them, people fell for each other in ways that had nothing to do with negotiation or strategy. They fell the way people fall now, suddenly, inconveniently, without asking permission from anyone including themselves. In ancient Greece, the understanding of love was more philosophically complex and considerably more anxious. The Greeks recognized that what we call falling in love was essentially a loss of control, and a culture that placed enormous value on self-mastery found this deeply uncomfortable. The word they used most often for the experience was eros, and it was understood not primarily as a warm feeling but as a kind of invasion. Eros arrived from outside. It struck you. It disrupted your thinking and your judgment and your ability to act like a rational person. The image of Cupid with his arrows is not decorative mythology. It is an accurate representation of how the Greeks actually experienced romantic attraction, as something that happened to you, not something you chose. There are accounts in Greek literature of people trying to reason their way out of being in love, running through logical arguments for why the feeling was irrational, and failing completely. Which is to say, the Greeks were essentially the same as everyone who has ever made a list of reasons why a particular relationship is a bad idea and then ignored every single one of them. What is striking about the Greek material is how much attention was paid to the specific mechanics of attraction. There were observations about eye contact, about the way desire seemed to travel through the gaze, about how the presence of someone beautiful created a particular kind of confusion in the person looking. There were observations about voice, about the way a specific tone or quality of speech could affect someone disproportionately. These were not superstitions. They were attempts to describe, using the available vocabulary, something that modern neuroscience now maps in terms of dopamine and norepinephrine and the activation of specific regions in the brain. The mechanisms they identified were real. They just did not have the tools to explain why those mechanisms worked the way they did. In ancient Rome, the evidence is even more abundant, because the Romans were enthusiastic documenters of their own emotional lives and had poets of extraordinary skill who made it their central project to describe exactly what romantic obsession felt like from the inside. Reading the Roman love poets is one of the most disorienting experiences available to anyone interested in the history of human emotion, because the feelings they describe in meticulous detail are completely contemporary. The jealousy, the sleeplessness, the compulsive reconstruction of every interaction, searching for signs, the willingness to completely humiliate yourself for someone who is not behaving well. the specific torture of wanting to stop wanting someone and being entirely unable to do it. One Roman poet describes lying awake running through a mental inventory of everything he finds unbearable about the woman he is in love with, concluding that none of it matters at all, that he is helpless, and that this particular helplessness is the defining condition of his existence. This was written approximately 2,000 years ago. It could have been written this morning. Roman society, like every ancient society, operated within structures that constrained who could formally be with whom. Marriage was an institution with social, legal, and economic dimensions that had very little to do with romantic feeling. But the Romans were remarkably clear-eyed about the gap between the institution of marriage and the experience of falling in love, and their literature engages with that gap honestly rather than pretending it did not exist. The love affairs that the poets describe were often outside marriage, often transgressive by the standards of the time, and described with a directness that sometimes surprises readers who expect ancient texts to be more decorous. They were not. When it came to love, the Romans documented what actually happened, not what was supposed to happen. The question worth pausing on here, the one that actually changes how you understand all of this, is why human beings fall in love in the first place. Not the neurochemical sequence, which is now reasonably well understood, but the deeper why. Why has this specific experience, this overwhelming fixation on one particular individual, been present in every human culture across all of recorded history and almost certainly long before it? Here is something genuinely surprising. The anthropological evidence suggests that romantic love, in the sense of an intense selective attachment to a specific individual rather than a general drive toward reproduction, appears to be a human universal. Not a Western invention. Not a medieval European development, despite what some outdated theories claimed.
Universal.
Archaeological evidence, cross-cultural studies, and the comparative analysis of love concepts across hundreds of unrelated languages and societies all point to the same conclusion. This is something built into the structure of being human, not something any civilization invented or imposed. What ancient civilizations did invent were the frameworks for managing it. Every culture developed rituals, songs, stories, courtship practices, and eventually formal institutions designed to channel and contain something that, left entirely unmanaged, had a strong tendency to overturn social arrangements. The Mesopotamian fertility hymns, the Egyptian love songs, the Greek symposium poetry, the Roman elegies, the Vedic hymns from ancient India describing the union of masculine and feminine cosmic principles as the model for human longing. All of these are different cultural technologies for doing the same thing, which is taking an experience that happens in the body and the nervous system and giving it a shape, a meaning, a place inside the larger story a culture tells about what it means to be alive and human. Think about what falling in love actually involved for a person living in ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE. You woke before sunrise, in a city that was already astonishingly complex by any standard we might apply to that era. Ur, at its height, had a population of somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people. It had specialized labor, administrative bureaucracy, religious institutions, and a legal system. It had neighborhoods. You walked through streets that smelled of bread and animals and the river. You went to the market, or to the temple precinct, or to work at whatever your particular role in the city required. And somewhere in the course of that completely ordinary day, you saw someone. And something happened in you that made the rest of the day feel different. And that night, you could not sleep correctly. And the next morning, you looked for them. The courtship practices that followed from that moment varied enormously by place, period, social class, and gender. But what preceded the courtship, that first involuntary recognition, that specific person among all possible persons? The evidence strongly suggests that this part of the experience was not so different from anything that happens today. The neurobiology was identical, because the brain doing the falling was the same brain, operating the same systems, flooded by the same molecules. The context was different. The rules about what you could do about it were different. But the initial experience of being struck, of finding yourself suddenly and helplessly attentive to one particular human being in a way you had not chosen and could not entirely undo, that part was the same. There is one more detail worth carrying with you, one that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. In ancient Egypt, there is evidence of what might be called love magic, specific incantations and rituals intended to cause a particular person to become attracted to you. This is often presented as evidence of how different ancient thinking was from our own. But consider what it actually proves. It proves that people in ancient Egypt fell for specific individuals who did not necessarily feel the same way in return, and that this unrequited state was painful enough that people sought out remedies for it. Which is not a story about ancient Egypt. It is a story about being human. The desire to make someone love you back when they do not yet know you are alive in that particular way. This is not a historical curiosity. This is Tuesday. What aspect of ancient love surprised you most? Leave it in the comments, because the range of answers that tend to come up in conversations like this one is genuinely fascinating, and says as much about us as it does about the ancient world. The Mesopotamian love poem from 4,000 years ago is still readable. The Egyptian girl who could not eat because a boy walked past her house is still recognizable. The Roman poet lying awake cataloging his helplessness is still embarrassingly familiar. This is what the history of love ultimately reveals. Not how much has changed, but how little. Every modern system for meeting people, every convention around dating and attraction, every rule about what you are supposed to feel and when and for whom, all of it is the latest version of something every human civilization has tried to build around an experience that was never really containable to begin with. The feeling came first. Everything else was built around it, in an attempt to give form to something that, as anyone who has ever experienced it knows, consistently refuses to hold the shape you give it. If this kind of journey into the human past is what you come here for, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And if you know someone who has ever been helplessly in love, which is to say if you know a human being, send this to them.